That already tells you that somehow the schizophrenic patients is in a very strange way, on the one hand open to the world, and on the other hand closed to the world. And that what phenomenologists like Palmer's, it was already mentioned by Vittorio, described as an attunement. We are always already on a pre-reflective, pre-propositional, pre-conceptual level. This is exactly the same level Vittorio pointed out for the motor system. We are already attuned, related to the world. And the question is, what are the neuronal mechanisms of that? When you go back into the history of psychiatry, I'm originally from Germany, so now I live in Canada. It's really described what is the basic disturbance in schizophrenia. So it's basically, as you all know, the question, what is the basic disturbance in diabetes? And of course, you know it's insulin deficiency. We don't know that in schizophrenia yet. Earlier psychiatrists like Kraepelin assumed like a lack of inner coherence, like a orchestra without a conductor. Bleuler, somehow impacted by the psychoanalysis of his time, splitting and dissociation of the ego. Another German psychiatrist, Joseph Berze, spoke of basic alterations of self-consciousness. So from the phenomenological side, as I already said, they speak of some kind of pre-reflective, pre-conceptual attunement. And that this attunement relationship to the world is altered in schizophrenia. And what I try to put forward now, sort of a neurophenomenal or neurophenomenological hypothesis supported by data. Let me go to the next one. So the first thing what I distinguish is different forms of attunement. There is, for instance, that goes closely, but it's not identical to what Vittorio presented, what I call interoceptive attunement. And the emphasis here is really on interoceptive. So it's really the interoceptive function, how they relate to exoceptive stimuli. For instance, there would be, and I will show you a study how we are testing for that. So this is sort of, whereas Vittorio starts from the outside of the body, looks at the sensory motor functions, I start from the inside of the body, how the interoceptive functions are attuned to the world. Then you have intersubjective attunement that was touched upon by Vittorio with the mirror neurons. You know, that's the intersubjective relation. You know the relationship to schizophrenic patients. There's always some strangeness which is hard to explain. Then the extroceptive attunement, this is already touched upon, a sense of minusness, ipseity. I don't need to repeat that. But what is essential here, that the stimuli and objects from the world are experienced in a subjective way. And the minusness is a result of that. And this basic form of subjectivity, I intentionally use this philosophical term, seems to be altered. And then, of course, there may also be an intrasubjective attunement where you have to relate and attune the various functions, sensory-motor functions, affective functions, cognitive functions to each other. And you often see in the symptoms in schizophrenic patients a discrepancy of the affective functions in relation to the sensory-motor function or the cognitive functions. So what I will focus on, and here this is basically the same thing, there's a disturbance in the interoceptive attunement, the disturbance in the subjectivity of the body, isolation, alienation of the own self from the other, extroceptive attunement, and this is important. There's diminished self-affectivity, as Parnas described it. So what does it mean? The stimulus does not affect you in a subjective way. It is processed purely mechanical, but it doesn't affect yourself. And if it doesn't affect yourself, of course, you cannot feel it. I will show you why. I have a hypothesis based on our data, why that is. And that leads, Stangelini described this very nicely, to a crisis of common sense and self-alienation. And the question I will focus in the following on these two. And the question for me is, what are the neuronal mechanisms underlying this? Because if we do not understand the neuronal mechanism, we will not be able to understand why there are these symptoms and not other symptoms. And then also, if we understand the mechanism, we might be able to devise new forms of psychotherapeutic and pharmacological intervention. So let me start with this one, the interoceptive attunement. As I said, I come from a slightly different, I come from the inside of the body, whereas Vittorio came from the outside of the body. But ultimately, we meet here in Torino. So, interoceptive awareness, what is this? You're aware of your own body, for instance, of your own heart rate, and that ultimately is part of body awareness. So, what did we do in fMRI? We did a particular task. We did the so-called counting heartbeat, so you have to become aware of your own heartbeat, and it's relatively easy to do. And sort of you silently have to count your own heartbeat. I hope it beats every second. And then you have to give a response afterwards, how many heartbeats you heard. So we intentionally disentangled the perception period from the judgment period. It's all important to remove task-related effects. And the control condition was a tone, an auditory tone, which was continuously presented, individualized in the rhythm to the heart rhythm to the respective subjects. So, and then either subjects had to count the heartbeat or the tone. And so it's basically really where your awareness goes. Does your awareness go internally towards your own heart / your interoceptive body, or does it go externally towards the external environment? It was already touched in the previous talks that a disbalance between internal and external awareness. So these are some preliminary data. So here we have a whole brain analysis of the count tones. You remember awareness of the tones as extroceptive stimuli versus fixation cross. And you see quite a difference between healthy and schizophrenic patients. So we scanned these patients before and after psychodynamic psychotherapy. I only show you the results from before the psychodynamic psychotherapy. So this is a pretty unique sample. And what you can see, there's a huge difference in the degree of activation. It's just how the awareness towards the external tone, you see, simply doesn't activate the brain anymore. So if you want to say, remember the concept of self-alienation, you can say there is a brain alienation. The stimulus simply doesn't affect the brain anymore. Why? I will come back to that later. Most important, very interestingly, what you also see, you do not see much auditory cortex activation. Here, this is a typical auditory cortical activation, very nice. You barely see the auditory cortex activated anymore. So this really seems to be that this extras as simple as the awareness of an external stimulus. It's a very simple tone. You see the major difference. So now imagine more complex stimuli. How does that affect the experience of the patient? They simply do not experience this. They do not feel, they do not process, and do not feel this stimuli. Next one. Now I come to the inside of the body, the heartbeat. So this is a typical pattern which you see, salience network, anterior insula, dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. This is a typical pattern. And you see the pattern is relatively normal in these patients. The accuracy was similar. There was no difference. The objective heartbeat was also normal. So that's a very interesting, as I said, these are preliminary data, not yet fully analyzed. But what it really tells you, there really seems to be a disbalance between intro and extroceptive stimuli in the processing. That simply the extroceptive stimuli are apparently not properly processed anymore. So then we did the next step, because the main idea, where does this come from? And you know that any neuronal activity is mediated by what is called the excitation-inhibition balance. It's a balance between excitation and inhibition, and that balance is mediated by gamma, this was a Freud lapsus, GABA and glutamate. So what now we wanted to know, where does this decreased activity in auditory cortex come from? Maybe it comes from decreased neuronal excitation and hence from decreased glutamate. And there has been some evidence for abnormal glutamate in these patients. So what we did using magnetic resonance spectroscopy, imaging this in the anterior insula, in the auditory cortex, and the perigenial anterior cingulate as part of the default mode network. So these are the results. And interestingly, we only found significant differences in the auditory cortex. And this is what you see. So these are the healthy subjects. This is the glutamate together with glutamine. So you see a significant reduction in the schizophrenic patient. So this is before psychodynamic psychotherapy, and you see a significant reduction, and here that persists. So that now the next step, what we're currently doing, is that we want to correlate the decrease in glutamate with the decreased auditory cortical activity. So ultimately, it may be due to a decreased level of glutamate and neuronal excitation. What can we conclude from that? There seems to be a disbalance between intro and extroceptive awareness in these patients. That the extroceptive awareness is decreased and leads to significantly lower activity, in particular the auditory cortex. And of course, if the simple auditory stimulus does not activate your auditory cortex anymore, there's no chance for you to feel and to experience that stimulus. So ultimately, the brain alienation leads to self-alienation. And meaning that the interoceptive stimuli might be processed relatively stronger. The absolute degree might still be the same, but the relative degree might be stronger. And that may probably be central for schizophrenia. And I remember that the basic symptoms in schizophrenia, and also Scharfetter in his ego psychopathology, always emphasize the body symptoms, the abnormal interoceptive awareness. And this might be just secondary due to a disbalance between intro-extroceptive stimuli. So there is a basic loss of subjectivity of stimuli from the environment. So the environment is just experienced in a purely objective, mechanical way. And then, of course, you don't feel anymore, you cannot relate to it anymore. So let me skip this one. So now the question is, but what I showed you is just extroceptive stimuli are not processed in the auditory cortex. What I did not show you is how are these stimuli in the auditory cortex related to the own self? This may be a different mechanism. I only showed you lack of stimulus processing. I did not show you the association of the extroceptive stimulus with the self, and that maybe even the auditory cortex may already be central for that. So now so we conducted a study. This is unfortunately so far only in healthy subjects, and we intend and would love to do the same thing in schizophrenic patients. So what we did here is, this is a Chinese postdoc of mine who's very interested in the own name. So what happens when you hear your own name? You may know the cocktail party effect. You're on a party, everything is busy, everything speaks, so everybody speaks, and suddenly, and you can't identify anything, but suddenly somebody utters your own name, and you're attentive. Yeah? So this is not narcissism, this is physiology. This is a cocktail party, psychology. And so this is one of the reasons. So if that is the case, then you would assume that your own name has a certain processing advantage in auditory cortex. And this is very interesting because it's just a simple, basic sensory region. So this is exactly what he can show here. So he presented subjects the own name, a familiar name, like in your case, Berlusconi, and an unknown name. And you see here there's significantly higher activity during the own name. So your auditory cortex gets much stronger involved and activated by hearing the own name. So the physical features of the names were controlled for. So the only difference this can be traced back to must be a difference in the degree of self-reference or self-relevance or self-importance. So there is an intrinsically subjective effect here, and you can see here the bold curves, you can see here the bar diagrams. So that, of course, raises the question, and this is an important, so why does the auditory cortex react preferably to the own name? So that means that the resting state of the auditory cortex must contain certain features which enables it and makes it possible for it to react and to show more activity. Somehow there must be a special interaction between the resting state and the own name. Because after all, when you hear your own name, it's just certain physical features. It's nothing else. It is the brain which constrains, which constructs these letters as your own name. But what you are presented is just a bunch of letters. The same when you hear music. It is not that you are presented a melody. You're just basically presented a bunch of tones and your brain constructs a melody. So same here. So this and many other findings led us to the central importance of the resting state, whether there are some hidden features in the brain's intrinsic activity, its own idiosyncratic activity, which might sort of predict how it can or cannot react to exoceptive stimuli. And this is exactly what we assume in schizophrenia. So in schizophrenia, it has been well known that there is increased activity in the resting state in auditory cortex. So this is well documented. So when the external stimulus hits, basically the level of activity can no longer be increased because it is already high. And so that means there's no task-related activity. And this is exactly what we see in our data I showed you earlier. During exoceptive awareness, there's no activity in auditory cortex anymore. So, and now we investigate the resting state in that data set. So, and what happens? But you have the same level during your intrinsic activity as the healthy subject has when the external stimulus comes. And then the healthy subject hears a voice at that level of neuronal activity. So what do you think your schizophrenic patient does? He hears a voice because he has the same level of activity. So the question then is, why is this voice so related? So how does the resting state modulate neuronal activity to exoceptive stimuli, and particularly to the self? So how does the resting state modulate the degree of subjectivity? So for that, as I said, you need to discuss about rest-stimulus interaction. So, and Pengming Qin, the Chinese postdoc, he did a very clever study. So he presented again own name, familiar name, unknown name, and then he presented these names in two different resting state conditions: eyes open, eyes closed. When you have eyes open, you have an increase in the auditory cortex. So now, you would expect that when you present the names, you have also an increase in activity, but it's due to the increase due to eyes open when compared to eyes closed. So this applies to unknown name and to familiar name. This is familiar name, unknown name during eyes closed. This is unknown name, familiar name during eyes open, and you see the difference, and this difference corresponds to the eyes open, eyes closed difference. This is the easy case. Here, in the case of the own name, you don't have that. The own name doesn't care about the level of the resting state. It just induces activity no matter what the level of the resting state. And that means that there must be some special feature in the resting state, which we don't know yet, hidden, which somehow says, okay, we just activate the cocktail party effect. So this would be very interesting to investigate in schizophrenia because, of course, you would assume that this no longer exists in schizophrenia patients. Same, I skipped that for the lack of time. Let me come to the last slides. So then you have another step. I showed you decreased exteroceptive processing. I showed you how exteroceptive stimuli are related in a subjective way by auditory cortex, and that the own name has an advantage. What I didn't show you, how now can you make the step from the self to experience, meaning from the self to consciousness. Self by itself does not imply consciousness. I showed you in this slide, I don't want to go into detail, the philosophers usually implicitly, most often implicitly, tacitly presuppose self implies consciousness, but that is not necessarily so. I think psychiatric disorders, many show the opposite. So now, how do you make the step from the self, from the subjective processing to the conscious processing? So for that, we investigate vegetative patients, and we again present self-related stimuli. So this was done in China. So self-referential question, have you been to Torino? Have you been to Ottawa? I'm sure you don't want to go there. It's minus 20 now, and plenty of snow. So that's a non-self-referential question. For me, the Ottawa question, obviously, is a highly self-referential question. So, and then we compared this in patients with vegetative state. The most famous one, most recent, is Michael Schumacher. I'm sure you know him from the Formula 1, Ferrari. And what we see, we still see, and this is very interesting, this was an auditory paradigm, we still see auditory cortical activity in these patients, despite the fact that they are not conscious. When you compare self, non-self, nevertheless, you see activity, reduced activity in the default mode network. Anterior, perigeneal anterior cingulate, posterior cingulate cortex. And you see still some activity, self, non-self differentiation, but not so much in these patients. And most interestingly, the degree of self, non-self differentiation predicted your degree of consciousness. So that maybe, and that makes sense when you look into psychopathology, the more you experience, the more self-related, the higher your degree of awareness. Depression patients are a typical example of that, of this heightened awareness, the increased self-focus as we described it. So you can see this, and this is the only correlation. If you do cognitive paradigms with these patients, you find activity, but it doesn't correlate with consciousness. So the self-referential, the degree of subjectivity processed in the brain might be central in driving your degree of possible consciousness. So then we did the resting state in these patients. Very interesting, and again, you see decreased functional connectivity in the midline region, default movement. Even more interesting is that the variability, this is the amplitude of low frequency fluctuation, that the degree of variability is significantly decreased in the resting state. So there are no longer as many spontaneous fluctuations anymore. So these are the different frequency bands, and interestingly, we could replicate the same findings in anesthesia patient as a paper which will be published this year. If the floor would be differently, this room would have a completely different design. And we often neglect the floor / the brain's intrinsic activity. And more less findings in psychiatric patients, schizophrenia, depression, hint that there's a basic disturbance in the intrinsic activity, and that is closely related to a basic disturbance in the self. And that ultimately leads that you really try to view consciousness from the inside of the brain, that you do not come from external, from the stimulus side, from what the investigator applies to the brain, but what the brain itself provides or does not provide, as in our patients. Thank you very much.